Deep in the California desert, under a sky painted in the bruised gold of dusk, stands a structure that officially doesn't exist. Behind these padlocked doors, the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions. This is where the secrets of the Cold War were forged. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of jet fuel and the quiet intensity of men obsessed with the impossible. Beneath a heavy canvas tarp, a silhouette emerges, sleek, dark, and faster than anything the world had ever imagined. At the center of it all was Kelly Johnson, a man whose mind moved faster than the very jets he designed. 1945. The world celebrated the end of the greatest conflict in history, but for the United States, a new, colder shadow was falling. The Iron Curtain had descended, leaving America blind to the military secrets hiding within the vast Soviet interior. Early reconnaissance planes were sitting ducks. Vulnerable, slow, and easily tracked by Soviet radar, they were a disaster waiting to happen. Johnson knew the future of aviation required a radical departure from the norm. He had already given the world the P-38 Lightning, a twin-tailed devil that dominated the skies of World War II. But his true genius lay in his simplicity. He would sketch the most complex aerodynamic curves with a single confident stroke of his pencil. In 1943, under a circus tent set up next to a noxious plastics factory, the Skunk Works was born out of pure necessity. They had 143 days to build America's first jet fighter. The team worked 24/7, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and pure adrenaline. It was a culture of rebellion. No bureaucracy, no committees, just the best engineers in the world and a shared sense of urgency. By 1953, the crisis reached a breaking point. President Eisenhower knew the Soviet Union was building a massive bomber fleet. The Killian Committee demanded the impossible, a plane that could fly higher than any missile and see everything. Johnson's solution would take them to the very edge of space, where the sky turns black and the Earth reveals its curvature. The U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird were coming. The age of high-altitude reconnaissance had begun, and Kelly Johnson was its architect. In the shadows of the Cold War, a secret request arrived that would change the course of aviation history forever. A mysterious visitor entered the Skunk Works office, carrying requirements for a plane that many thought was impossible to build. 70,000 feet, 4,000 miles. These figures defied every law of aerodynamics known to man in 1954. Legendary engineer Kelly Johnson looked at the specs, felt the weight of the mission, and simply nodded. The race was on. Work began in total secrecy. The team reimagined the aircraft as a powered glider, pushing structural limits to their breaking point. Standard fuel would boil at high altitudes. They had to invent a new chemistry, just to keep the engines running in near vacuum. At 60,000 feet, a pilot's blood would boil without protection. A revolutionary pressurized suit was their only hope for survival. The U-2's wings stretched 80 feet across fragile, elegant, and designed to ride the thin air at the very edge of space. To test this ghost plane, they needed a place that didn't exist. They found it in the desolate heart of the Nevada desert. Upon the salt flats of Groom Lake, the foundations of the world's most famous secret base were quietly laid. Elite pilots were brought in on windowless transport planes, never knowing exactly where they were, only what they had to do. Test pilot Tony LeVire knew the risks. One wrong move at peak altitude meant certain death in the freezing, airless void. Putting on the silver suit was a brutal, claustrophobic ritual, preparing the man for an environment hostile to all life. The cockpit was a foam booth of toggles and dials, where every inch of space was sacrificed for weight and performance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the silhouette of a machine, unlike any other, prepared to touch the heavens. August 1955. On the shimmering heat of the Groom Lake runway, the U-2 prepared for its maiden flight. It took flight almost instantly, climbing at a vertical angle that stunned even the brilliant men who built it. From 70,000 feet, the world looked different. The curvature of the Earth was no longer a theory, but a breathtaking view. The impossible had been achieved. Kelly Johnson touched the metal of his creation, knowing they had successfully conquered the high frontier. In the mid-1950s, the world held its breath. Two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation, separated by a wall of absolute secrecy. To win the Cold War, the United States needed to see the unseeable. They needed a bird that could fly where no one could follow. At 70,000 feet, the Dragon Lady was alone. Below, the Soviet Union lay hidden behind a veil of clouds and ironclad defense systems. The first mission was a gamble of historic proportions. Crossing the border meant risking everything for a glimpse into the heart of the Kremlin. The results were stunning. High-resolution cameras captured Moscow and Leningrad with a clarity never seen before in the history of aerial reconnaissance. In Washington, the weight of this secret operation rested on one man's shoulders. President Dwight D. Eisenhower knew the cost of failure. Every flight was a violation of international law. Each mission brought the world closer to a potential nuclear flashpoint if a pilot was caught. Using a magnifying glass, he peered into the secrets of the enemy. The photos proved the Soviet bomber gap was a myth. While Eisenhower weighed the political risks, deep inside the Soviet Union, the silence of the skies was being challenged by glowing green screens. A blip appeared where nothing should exist. The Soviet military was frantic. They knew an intruder was above, but their missiles couldn't reach it. Nikita Khrushchev was informed immediately. The humiliation was unbearable. The Americans were mocking Soviet air defenses from the edge of space. The technological heart of the U-2 was its revolutionary eye, the Perkin-Elmer camera system, a masterpiece of optical engineering. Miles of high-grade film captured every railway junction and missile silo. It was the most significant intelligence haul in human history. In windowless rooms in Washington, CIA specialists analyzed every frame. They were counting the tools of war, one photograph at a time. But none of this would have been possible without the legendary Skunk Works and the man who led it, Kelly Johnson. Johnson operated by his own rules. He cut through bureaucracy to build the impossible in record time, driven by engineering perfection. His team worked in total secrecy, creating a plane that was essentially a glider with a jet engine, light enough to touch the stars. The era of the U-2 changed the world. It turned the tide of the Cold War and birthed the modern age of global surveillance. Even today, the legacy of these early missions continues. A story of high-stakes politics, engineering genius, and the courage to fly into the unknown. In the 1950s, rumors of silver phantoms haunted the skies. Pilots reported sightings that defied the laws of physics and altitude. The public called them UFOs. The government called them a necessity. This is the untold story of the U-2 spy plane. While the world looked at the stars, the CIA was looking at the Soviet Union, hidden behind a veil of absolute secrecy. The U-2 and its successor, the SR-71, became the eyes of the Cold War, flying where no radar could reach. But every mission had a human face. For Francis Gary Powers, the dream of flight began in the quiet fields of Virginia. He would soon exchange his civilian life for a pressurized suit and a mission that would change history forever. Every cockpit was equipped with a secret, a self-destruct switch to ensure the technology never fell into Soviet hands. May 1st, 1960, Peshawar, Pakistan. The engine roars to life for a flight that was never supposed to end in a crash. Powers crossed the border, moving silently over the snow-capped peaks of Afghanistan, deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. But the Soviets were waiting. A new weapon, the SA-2 missile, was locked onto the American ghost plane. The shockwave was instantaneous. The unsinkable spy plane was torn apart in the thin, freezing air. Pinned by G-forces, Powers fought for his life. The self-destruct switch was inches away, but gravity was a cruel master. He managed to bail out, a lone figure falling through the sky as the wreckage of $1 billion secret rained down around him. He landed in a rural wheat field, not as a hero, but as a prisoner of the Cold War. In Washington, the silence was deafening. The radar screen at the CIA station had gone blank. The cover-up began immediately. The American government told the world it was a weather plane. They assumed Powers was dead and the evidence destroyed. But Nikita Khrushchev had a trap. He waited for the lie to spread before revealing the pilot and the wreckage. The mangled remains of the U-2 became a symbol of a massive intelligence failure and the end of American invincibility. The era of absolute secrecy was over. The silver flash in the sky had fallen, leaving behind a world changed by the truth.
May 1960. The eyes of the world turned to Paris, hoping for a thaw in the Cold War at the long-awaited summit. But the peace was shattered before it began. Nikita Khrushchev, fueled by the capture of an American spy plane, erupted in fury. Across the aisle, President Eisenhower stood his ground. He refused to apologize for the U-2 missions, citing national security. The summit disintegrated. A grand hall that was meant for diplomacy now stood as a silent witness to the growing divide. In Moscow, the pilot at the center of the storm faced his fate. Francis Gary Powers sat alone before his captors. The trial was a global spectacle. Charges of espionage were read as the Kremlin sought to humiliate the Western superpower. Thousands of miles away, the cost of the Cold War was felt in a quiet Virginia living room. 2 years later, a pre-dawn fog clung to the Glienicke Bridge, the border between two worlds. The deal was struck, an American pilot for a Soviet master spy. The exchange was about to begin. No words were spoken. In that moment, the machinery of international espionage ground to a silent, tense halt. Powers was home, but the era of the vulnerable spy plane was over. A new, faster ghost was needed. At the Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson and his team were already dreaming of the impossible. Mark III flight. They would build a plane that flew so fast it could outrun missiles, its skin glowing with the heat of friction. The SR-71 Blackbird was born, a titanium marvel that conquered the edge of space, where the sky turns to black. But the ultimate irony remained hidden. The very titanium used to spy on the Soviets was bought from them in secret.
On December 22, 1964, the SR-71 Blackbird made its first flight from Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. It was, and remains, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built by human hands. At full operational speed, it covered a mile every 1.7 seconds. It could cross the entire continental United States in 68 minutes. It flew so fast and so high that if a surface-to-air missile was launched at it, standard procedure was simply to accelerate. The Blackbird could outrun the missile. In its entire operational history, spanning decades of intelligence flights, not a single SR-71 was ever shot down. Nearly 1,000 missiles were fired at it. Every single one missed. The achievements of Skunk Works came at a price that was never announced in press releases. 12 pilots died during the development and operational testing of U-2 and SR-71 aircraft. Their deaths were classified. Their families were given cover stories, training accidents, unexplained crashes, mechanical failures in undisclosed locations. It was not until decades later, when documents were declassified, that some families finally learned the truth about what their loved ones had sacrificed. The secrecy that made Skunk Works successful was the same secrecy that denied these men and their families the recognition they deserved. The U-2 program raised questions that the Cold War had no comfortable answers for. Was it legal to fly over another sovereign nation's territory? By any standard interpretation of international law, no, it was not. Was it morally justified? Eisenhower believed it was. that the alternative, not knowing Soviet capabilities, was more dangerous than knowing. But there is another question. At what point does intelligence collection cross the line into a provocation that increases the risk of conflict? These were not academic questions. They were questions that the world is still asking today, now about drones, satellites, and cyber surveillance. By the early 1970s, Kelly Johnson was approaching retirement, but Skunk Works was not slowing down. The next frontier was invisibility. A young engineer named Ben Rich took over Skunk Works' leadership and began pursuing an aircraft that radar simply could not see. The principle was theorized by a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Afimtsev, whose paper on radar cross-section reduction was so obscure it wasn't even classified. Within years, Skunk Works had used it to build the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft. On the night of January 16, 1991, F-117 Nighthawks crossed into Iraqi airspace at the opening of Operation Desert Storm. Iraqi radar operators were watching their screens carefully. They saw nothing. The F-117 struck their targets with precision-guided bombs and were gone before the first explosion had finished echoing. The Nighthawk proved that a small team of engineers, given real authority, could produce machines that changed the nature of war itself. Kelly Johnson had been retired for a decade. Ben Rich called him immediately after the first mission. Johnson died 6 months later. In the mid-1950s, as the Cold War reached a fever pitch, a small, elite group of engineers changed the course of aviation history forever. This was Lockheed's Skunk Works, led by the legendary Kelly Johnson. Their philosophy was radical: eliminate bureaucracy and focus on pure engineering genius. The result was the U-2, a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet higher than any Soviet interceptor of the time. The U-2's most critical moment came in 1962. Major Richard Hazer prepared for a paired flight that would decide the fate of the world. Flying over Cuba, he discovered something terrifying. Soviet nuclear missiles were being positioned just 90 miles from American shores. Behind the engineering triumphs, Kelly Johnson carried a heavy burden. Every pilot lost was a personal tragedy for the man who built their wings. He often stood alone at the edge of the runway, watching his creations vanish into the night, wondering if they would ever return. The secrecy was absolute. Test pilots lived in the shadows, their identities and sacrifices hidden by a blurred veil of classification. Even as the U-2 served its purpose, Johnson was already looking toward the future, something faster, something even more invisible. The testing of these secret crafts at Groom Lake gave birth to modern mythology. To the locals, they weren't planes. They were UFOs. Mysterious lights in the Nevada desert sparked rumors of Area 51. But the reality was even more incredible than the fiction. Today, declassified documents continue to peel back the layers of Skunk Works, revealing a legacy of daring and innovation. The spirit of Kelly Johnson lives on. Wherever small teams dare to dream of the impossible, the secret history of Skunk Works continues. February 1962. A cold wind sweeps across the tarmac as Gary Powers returns to American soil, a man caught between two worlds. Behind the stoic gaze of the U-2 pilot lay the weight of the Cold War and the secrets of the stratosphere. But the homecoming was far from a hero's welcome. Powers soon found himself in the crosshairs of a Senate subcommittee. Questions swirled about why he hadn't destroyed the aircraft or used the lethal tools provided for the unthinkable. On a dark velvet surface lay the infamous suicide pill, a silver dollar hiding a lethal secret that Powers chose not to use. Years later, the high-altitude spy traded the edges of space for the smog-filled skies of Los Angeles. He became a staple of the morning commute, reporting on traffic while the world below remained largely unaware of his past. Then, tragedy struck in 1977. a mechanical failure led to a crash that claimed the life of the legendary pilot. While Powers' story seemed to end, the legacy of the Skunk Works was just entering a new, darker chapter. Ben Rich, the successor to Kelly Johnson, led the charge into the era of invisibility and stealth technology. From the shadows emerged the F-117 Nighthawk, a sharp-edged phantom that changed the face of modern aerial warfare. Rich would later chronicle these secret breakthroughs in his memoirs, revealing the hidden history of American aerospace dominance. Despite the rise of stealth, the Dragon Lady, the U-2 refused to be grounded, evolving with the digital age. The transformation was radical. What was once a nest of analog dials became a sophisticated digital command center. From 70,000 feet, the Earth's curve remains a constant, a silent witness to the missions that continue to this day. Decades later, the truth began to surface as classified files from the heart of the CIA were finally opened. In 1998, Gary Powers Jr. stood before the nation to accept the Silver Star, a long overdue honor for his father's service. The legacy of Gary Powers and the U-2 reminds us that history is often more complex than it first appears. Deep within a dusty Burbank hangar in 1943, a small group of engineers set out to do the impossible. They had one leader, Kelly Johnson. The philosophy was simple: no bureaucracy, no delays. Just pure innovation at the speed of thought. This was the birth of the Skunk Works. Even today, that spirit of obsession lives on. Modern teams still look to the pirate flag as a symbol of their unconventional approach to technology. Decades later, the shadows of these secret projects have found a home in the light of our national museums, telling stories of silent courage. None are more striking than the SR-71 Blackbird. Its titanium skin was designed to withstand the heat of 3 times the speed of sound. But behind the titanium and the records are the human stories. Gary Powers Jr. has spent a lifetime searching for the truth behind the secrets. In the quiet corridors of the Cold War Museum, we find the artifacts of heroes who were never allowed to speak of their work. To fly the U-2 was to walk a moral tightrope at 70,000 feet, drifting over territories where a single mistake could spark a war. Today, that moral frontier has moved from high-altitude cameras to the silent, unblinking eyes of satellites and modern drones. Kelly Johnson knew that innovation required risk. The U-2 was notoriously difficult to land, a delicate dance on the edge of failure. For every breakthrough, there was a trial by fire. In the shadow of the Cold War, a handful of visionaries redefined the limits of the possible. Led by the legendary Kelly Johnson, these men engineered the future from behind a veil of absolute secrecy. Men like Philip Coleman perfected the eyes of the sky, ensuring we could see the world without being noticed. Henry Combs tackled the impossible plumbing of high-pressure systems, keeping engines roaring in the thin, lethal air of the stratosphere. And Russ Daniel tamed the heat-resistant titanium of the SR-71 Blackbird, a craft that remains an engineering marvel. It began in 1943, a makeshift lab in a padlocked hangar that would eventually birth the world's most advanced aerospace technology. From the U-2 to the SR-71, the DNA of Skunk Works evolved into modern stealth and even space exploration. By 1989, the legendary U-2 sat on the Edwards Air Force Base runway, its silhouette etched against a purple dusk. Pilots like Gary Powers flew on the edge of space, encased in pressurized suits, isolated from the world they protected. High above the clouds, they saw the curve of the Earth and carried the weight of secrets they could never share. These men returned to quiet lives, unable to share their triumphs even with their own children. Today, at the Palmdale facility, a new generation takes the mantle, pushing the boundaries of hypersonic research. Kelly Johnson's 14 management principles still guide every project, fostering a culture of speed, simplicity, and trust. The legacy of Skunk Works isn't just in titanium or stealth. It's in the spirit of those who dream in the dark. They changed history without seeking the spotlight. Their work speaks for them, echoing through the skies of tomorrow. Subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world, and share your favorite Skunk Works aircraft in the comments.